Well, hello, everybody. Alan Rettig here with a short presentation that I first gave in the fall of 2021 at the 42nd Annual Saturday with Sherlock Holmes at the Enoch Pratt Free Library in Baltimore. It combines my love of Sherlock Holmes with my longtime work in media production. I call it Fiddling with the Gramophone. The text for today's sermon is an admonition by Sherlock Holmes to a count and his faithful enforcer. No violence, gentlemen, no violence. I beg of you, consider the furniture. It's found in the adventure of the Mazarin Stone, where we see that a gramophone has indeed taken its place as part of the furniture at 221B. The Mazarin Stone was published in the Strand magazine and Hearst's International magazine in the fall of 1921, 17 years after Baring Gould says it took place in the summer of 1903. Now, you won't find the Mazarin Stone on many Sherlockians' top 10 lists. In fact, on some of those lists, it ranks 60th out of 60. What makes so many people think this story is so awful? Well, for one thing, there seems to be a new blueprint for the flat at 221B. There's a second door to the bedroom, and we've added a waiting room. It's one of only two stories that's written in the third person. We do miss Watson's voice. So who did write it? Did Watson change his approach? Did the literary agent write it? Many have pointed out that it resembles Doyle's play The Crown Diamond. Or was somebody just commissioned to knock it out? Whatever, it reads like a not very compelling pastiche. Oh, and it's really not much of an adventure either, because Holmes has already solved the case as the curtain goes up. Pretty thin gruel. And then there's the matter of plagiarism. Some elements are lifted directly from the adventure of the empty house, including the decoy in the window, the air gun, and the fact that the marksmen in both stories have reputations as big game hunters. Okay, so what's the other side of the coin? What makes the Mazarin Stone so great? Technology. Holmes was a Victorian early adopter. He used the telephone liberally. He was no stranger to early motor cars. And we learn here that Baker Street sported a gramophone. Here's how it figures in the plot. Holmes finds himself alone in his sitting room with Count Negretto Silvius and explains in detail how he knows that Silvius has stolen a valuable crown diamond. Silvius has already been amazed by the wax decoy of Holmes in the window when they're joined by Silvius's lapdog and personal goon, Sam Merton, who's been waiting outside. Holmes suggests that Silvius and Merton discuss their options, the jewel or jail. He says, I'm going into that bedroom. I shall try over the Hoffman barcarolle upon my violin. In 5 minutes, I shall return for your final answer. He goes into the bedroom, plays the barcarolle not on his violin, but on his gramophone, then slips through the second door, sneaks behind the curtain, and replaces the bust with his own fine self. He hears Silvius and Merton's incriminating conversation, and when they both come to the window to admire the stone, which was in Silvius's pocket all along, Holmes grabs it. Final score, Holmes and the gramophone 1, Silvius and Merton 0. So, since the gramophone is the real star of the show, I think we should take a closer look at it. Edison's first audio players, later modified by Bell, were actually called graphophones. They appeared in the 1870s and were sold well into the 1880s. They used wax cylinders played by a needle that tracked the grooves on the spinning tube. By the 1890s, graphophones had become gramophones, using flat shellac discs. And since the Mazarin Stone is dated in the first years of the new century, it was indeed a flat disc gramophone that was part of the Baker Street furniture. Now, when I began this investigation, my goal was to determine whether a gramophone record of the day could possibly be mistaken for a live performance. Given the primitive recording techniques and the inferior quality of the sound, could Count Silvius be fooled by the substitution? For the record, so to speak, we must mention that according to Anthony Boucher via Les Klinger, no solo violin recording of the barcarolle existed in 1903. Boucher says that Holmes must have used a private recording of his own playing. Okay, fine, we'll go with that. Here you get a look at the technology of the day. These were acoustical recordings, meaning there were no electronics involved. The microphone was nothing more than a backwards megaphone, which concentrated the sound to vibrate a needle by brute force as it cut into the soft spinning master. I did come up with a violin recording of the barcarolle from 1914, but it has a piano accompaniment. Listen. Well, I've got to admit that it sounded better than I thought it would, but I still wasn't convinced that it could pass for a live performance. Lots of records scratched, not a very powerful sound. Plus, it was recorded a decade after the story took place. So I asked my music historian friend Michael Kravitz if he could come up with a solo violin disc from the turn of the century. Not only did he oblige, but he sent me a recording by this man, a particular favorite of Sherlock Holmes. I'm sure many of you remember that Holmes went to an afternoon recital by Sarasate during the Red-Headed League adventure. A few years ago, I even wrote a poem about it. They dug the bank tunnel for days, while Jabez copied out all the A's. When Holmes spotted the plot, he enjoyed Sarasate, then foiled the foul fiend called John Clay. But I digress. Here then is Sarasate with some Bach, recorded in 1904. Even though it's an older recording than the barcarolle, it's really not too bad. Now, I was pondering whether it would fool anybody when I realized that I hadn't set up the proper listening conditions. Silvius had listened to the recording through a closed door. Now, this is our home theater, and I show it to you simply to point out that it has a rather robust audio system, as you can see by the speakers there. So I decided to perform an experiment. Since my office adjoins the theater, I went inside and closed the door. I set up a microphone in the office to represent Silvius and Merton. Then I played the Sarasate recording out in the theater and recorded it from the office side of the closed door. Here is the result. I think the result is remarkable. The new listening conditions tend to erase many of the recording shortcomings. Much of the surface noise is gone, and the more distant violin actually sounds a bit more realistic. See if you don't agree. Here's a quick comparison. First, the original recording for 10 seconds. And here's the re-recorded version through the door. And so I formed my conclusion. Would the gramophone in the next room serve the purpose, fool the criminals, and allow Holmes to retrieve that yellow diamond? Yes, I believe that a scratchy gramophone played through a closed door would do the job. So whatever problems the story has aside from this, we cannot fault it for the gramophone ruse after all. In the few minutes I have left, I think it would be fun to bring the gramophone up to date a bit. By the mid-1930s, the acoustical recording method had given way to electronic recordings. We had microphones, mixing consoles, and starting in the mid-1940s, records were mastered on tape, which was a tremendous advancement. But the delivery system hadn't changed all that much. Yes, record players now had amplifiers and speakers, but the records themselves were still pieces of shellac spinning at 78 RPM. That all changed in 1945, thanks to this man, Peter Goldmark, an engineer at CBS Laboratories, and of course, CBS owned Columbia Records. Goldmark was a classical music fan, and he hated that the record had to be changed 7 or 8 times to get through a symphony. So he went to work, slowed the speed to 33 1/3 RPM, spaced the grooves much more tightly, changed the composition of the discs from shellac to vinyl, and came up with a record that would play for well over 20 minutes per side rather than 4. It was the birth of the long-playing record. Over the decades, the LP withstood challenges from cassette tapes, from open reel tapes, and does anybody remember the 8-tracks? Even with the advent of digital formats, the LP never went away. It's still beloved by audiophiles, and you can still buy those spinning discs along with some beautiful gramophones to play them on. So let's end by doing some then and now listening. Holmes chose the Offenbach barcarolle from the Tales of Hoffmann to serenade the Count. The piece is set in Venice, and as we listen, we're meant to imagine floating down the Grand Canal, past San Marco, and under the Rialto Bridge. We'll start with that old acoustical recording, but then we'll move on to something newer. As we do, we'll imagine Holmes sitting in the stalls, wrapped in the most perfect happiness. And that's my time for today. I hope you've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed being with you. Thanks very much.